So there's a few ways in which you can interpret the flood account that we get in Genesis. The Hebrew word that we often translate as earth within the Genesis flood account is this word eretz, which doesn't just mean like the earth, the totality of the earth, but also a land or a region or a nation. Now, whenever we're interpreting a word, we can't just simply choose what definition works with our ideology or whatever presupposition we're coming to the text with. We have to search for context clues. So the question really isn't, can we translate the word this way? The question is, does the context allow us to translate the word that way? And I would say yes, it just depends on how you interpret Genesis 1. You have to be consistent between Genesis 1 and Genesis 6. Because there's an argument to be made that Genesis 1 isn't about the cosmos, but rather more about the land of Israel. It's kind of hard for us to wrap our minds around because we tend to read Genesis 1 in like more of a scientific understanding. Whereas in the Jewish mind, the creation story is more about God preparing a land and a place to install his earthly priests. So if you believe that about Genesis 1 and 2, you could make the argument that that same context is being applied to Genesis 6, that God isn't judging the whole world, but rather the line of Adam, who was his earthly priest. The other argument that we could lend to this to make the idea or the case that it was just a regional flood is that it's from Noah that the nations on the earth spread out. We could make the case that prior to the flood, humanity had not dispersed out into the rest of the world. We hadn't done our job of being fruitful, multiplying, filling the earth, and subduing it because we were already doing a really horrible job at being fruitful, which is why the flood happened. So again, we could make the case that the flood didn't have to be global because humanity was regional and localized. This would also help the case of there being biodiversity across many different continents. Like if Noah only had two of every animal on the ark, which was only so big and could only hold so many animals, it would help fill in the gaps of why you have kangaroos in Australia but nowhere else. Now again, the main point of the flood story isn't scientific in nature. Rather, it's to show us something spiritual. Was it a real event? Yes. Peter again says that scoffers, people who reject God, reject the flood. Because the flood story tells us something about the justice of God and the rebirth that we must go through in order to enter into the kingdom of God. So can we make the case that this may have been a regional flood? Sure. What side of the aisle do I find myself on? I tend to lean more towards a global flood. And the reason is purely theological, that God had to cleanse not just a region of the earth, but rather the entire earth. But I'll be sure to ask him when I see him face to face